1, so we'll go to 8, and that's on the order paper at page 9. This is our Auckland Council submission on the draft national policy statement, Indigenous biodiversity. Now we've got Jenny Fuller here, the author of this report. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. Good morning, members of the committee. I have here's a brief presentation I'm just going to run through. I've been asked to keep it to 10 minutes, so I apologise if I start gabbling. So with the government's released an Impious on Indigenous biodiversity open for comment until the 14th of March. Next one. So the Impious has been developed originally by a collaborative group that was set up by the government, so that was comprised of members of different organisations such as Federated Farmers, Forest and Bird, Environmental Defence Society, forestry groups, and I think some infrastructure providers were also, involved in that. And so the driver for it was that there was a generally acknowledged need for some kind of national direction around Indigenous biodiversity. There's some lack of clarity in the RMA provisions and they're not very detailed. There's a concern that it's resulting in an undervaluing and loss of Indigenous biodiversity. And there's basically opportunities through the Impious to increase the amount and effectiveness of active management as well as regulatory responses. So just briefly, it's a long document, but just some of the key points are it's identifying an objective to maintain Indigenous biodiversity as a matter of national significance. So currently this maintaining Indigenous biodiversity nestles in the functions of councils, and this is elevating it up to a matter of national significance. And that includes basically keeping no reduction in size, species, ecosystem function, etc., all those things up there. It requires that SNAs are identified using the criteria in the MPS and then classified into high or medium. So SNAs would equate to our significant ecological areas. It directs what's called an effects management hierarchy that says that adverse effects are to be first avoided, then remedied, then mitigated, then offsetting compensation are considered once you've got residual adverse effects after you've done the avoid, remedy, mitigate. And essentially, this effects management hierarchy applies more stringently to high SNAs, and there's some feeling that it could potentially require a prohibited activity status for some of them, for SNAs in relation to some of the activities. It also requires us to prepare a regional biodiversity strategy and include restoration and enhancement, including restoration and enhancement of ecosystems and habitats. So, in other words, stuff that sits outside of the unitary plan but informs it. Oh, I'm sorry, I spelled regional wrong there. It only applies to terrestrial biodiversity except to the extent that restoration provisions do also apply to the freshwater environment. And it has to be given effect to in the unitary plan as an MPS. So our submissions is generally supportive, and we consider that much of the MPS is quite well aligned to what we have. We think it does give us an opportunity to both consolidate what we have and improve our regulatory and non-regulatory responses, so we're generally supportive of it. We do see some key issues for us, though, including this second point, which we generally raise to all our submissions to central government, that there's a greater need for integration of all the different national tools, and in particular the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management. In relation to the urban development one, there's a really lost opportunity there to recognise the value of Indigenous biodiversity in urban environments, and we're really trying to push that they join those two things up a bit better. We also suggest that some of the stretch provisions, which would be things like having to have a regional biodiversity strategy, having to specifically address restoration and enhancement, we support them because we are already doing that, and most of what the MPS is asking us to do, we're already sort of partway down the road of doing. But we know there are other councils around New Zealand that will definitely struggle to do both the core requirements, if you like, of identifying SNAs as well as all the other stuff around restoration and enhancement and having to deal with highly mobile fauna. So we're suggesting that some of those provisions could be voluntary rather than mandatory as they currently are framed. It would still give us the mandate to use them, but it would mean that other councils could concentrate on arguably more core functions. We think there's a greater need it needs to recognise regionally and locally important infrastructure. It currently makes provision for activities that could damage SNAs that are considered nationally significant, but there's no provision for stormwater or anything we might or AT or anything that we do at the local or regional level. And again, looking at the way it's been set out, arguably some of that stuff might become a prohibited activity or extremely difficult to do with the current framing. And we also see there is some role for the NPS to address all biodiversity, not just terrestrial biodiversity, and in particular, recognising the importance of situations where you've got Indigenous biodiversity extending across an environmental gradient or a domain boundary. So in other words, if you've got forests stretching into freshwater, a wetland, which then might adjoin a saline wetland down to the coast, those are really important and quite rare. So we're looking for some stronger recognition of that. We generally support the ecological significance criteria they propose, but we are suggesting some improvements to trying to make them more objective, including and appropriate, including recognising regionally threatened species and ecosystems. While the MPS does talk about threatened species, and it's focused very much only on nationally threatened species, so many of what we consider threatened wouldn't be recognised as such under the MPS. And we're also advocating that it's underpinned by a recognised ecosystem classification system, Singers and Rogers, which we use and which has been endorsed by most regional councils, but which is not recognised in the MPS. We have strong concerns with the direction to distinguish between high and medium SNAs for a number of reasons. We think the distinguishing attributes, as they call them, the things you'd use to tell if something was high or medium, are often very subjective. It's things like it's an important or a very important this or that. And ecologically, that is very difficult to distinguish. It could lead to some potentially inappropriate distinctions between different SNAs. So SNAs in the middle of the urban environment might come out as high, whereas some parts of the Waitakere Ranges may not, simply because of the lack of vegetation in the urban environment. Not to say those areas aren't important, but to specifically end up identifying them as high value as other areas as medium value seems a bit perverse. We also think that overall, anything that does end up with a medium identification will have its protection undermined over time. That's certainly the observation and experience of people who've worked with this sort of thing in the past. And one of the drivers for doing this was to try and reduce contention, like try and make it clear where this stronger effects management hierarchy is to apply. In our view, it's extremely unlikely to reduce litigation or contention. We'll have it both at the time when we first make the initial assessment of something's high or medium, but then any time a consent comes in, we'll be revisiting it again. And also, additionally, it's actually not necessary for most SNAs. This is only to play out this distinction between medium and high, and when you're considering an impact on it. And notwithstanding we have enormous growth pressures, most of our SNAs do not come under development pressure or in the medium to short term at least. So it's going to be an unnecessary exercise. It's just going to provoke a whole lot of contention for no particularly good reason. So for those reasons, we're advocating that they drop that requirement to distinguish between high and medium SNAs. So just turning briefly to the feedback we've had feedback from the IMSB, and I understand there's a little bit more to it than this, but essentially better recognition of rangatiratanga and Māori as partners, not just stakeholders, which is very much, there's no mention of rangatiratanga at all in the MPS, and while there's quite a lot that advocates, requires you to engage with mana whenua or tangata whenua as they frame it, in the development and implementation, the feedback from the IMSB is that it's putting Māori in the category of stakeholders rather than partners. In terms of local board feedback, we've had feedback from 10 local boards. I'd say generally it's aligned with our draft submission. Most boards agree there's a need for an MPS, and many of them reference this in the context of their own local biodiversity restoration and enhancement initiatives and projects. So Northwest Wild Link, things like that come through quite strongly in some of the submissions. Many of the local boards support the MPS applying to all environmental domains, so freshwater, coastal and terrestrial. Several identify the need for general tree protection rules to be reinstated, so this is repealing those bits of the RMA that restrict your ability to protect urban SNAs. We in Auckland have used regional rules which aren't constrained by section 76, 4A to 4D, but this MPS applies to local council, district councils, and they will effectively not be able to protect SNAs in urban environments given the current constraints in the RMA. So we're saying if you are insisting this becomes a district council function, then you need to make it possible to do that. 3 local boards specifically endorse the submission. Apparently there might have been more than that. Apologies if I missed that. Several of the local boards seek greater acknowledgement of the tiriti and the partnership with Māori, and generally supporting the provisions which promote greater involvement but seeking greater acknowledgement for those things. And notably, the Upper Harbour Local Board supports the distinction between high and medium. They say it's going to mean that any habitat made of Indigenous vegetation should be considered of high value with maximum protection, so they can see the benefit for their local board area, if you like, of most of their SNAs would come through as high, and they would support the strong protection that would imply. We've also engaged with the CCOs in Healthy Waters, so we've had feedback from AT, Water Care, and Healthy Waters. And all of them recognise, as the submission does, the implication of the Impious on the management of their delivery, operation and maintenance of necessary infrastructure. And they all support this submission point that we've raised around making better allowance for that stuff in the Impious. Some of them support greater integration across environmental domain boundaries, but healthy waters have some concerns about how that might play out in relation to management of stormwater infrastructure. But I think they do have some concerns, but I think that's about how you manage that issue rather than it necessarily being the MPS. And Watercare are doing their own submission, apparently. They advise that it will be in line with the council submission, but it's basically reinforcing the need for better provision for infrastructure and giving Wellington a bit of a 101 on Watercare and why it needs to function in Auckland, I think. And then we've also, just by way of background, we have been working with central government on other sort of implementation-focused things. So previously we gave them feedback to inform their Section 32 analysis of the draft, which is essentially their assessing the impact of the MPS. They used us as a case study for that. We're continuing to provide also more detailed feedback on the implementation issues. So in general, we're advising that we think we can do most of it within existing budget and resource, because for us the timing works quite well with the unitary plan review. But we're also signalling that we think other councils are going to need, and we would also support, value some extra guidance, but some councils are going to need some material support as well. We've also given quite a lot of emphasis on the implementation challenges as a requirement to distinguish between medium and high is going to cause us. And as I say, we generally seek guidance and material support for, particularly for the lesser resource councils. There are some councils around New Zealand that have done almost nothing in this space, so this MPS is going to be a huge shock for them to have to implement all in one go. So we're saying that government should be better supporting that. And next steps, just finalise the submission with Delegated Authority, which we're seeking today. We have to lodge it by March the 14th, and we are continuing to seek opportunities to engage with central government on issues of concern to us. So the central government have been quite open to conversations. There's been quite a few already happened, and we're going to continue to try and have those. That's it. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a fast trip through Indigenous biodiversity, and you've done it well. So we'll take some questions now, but I will put up at the outset, and I think Member Nabani will move. And there's just one small change, and I think that was reflected in the presentation. Jenny, you're supportive of that change in the Roman 1, sorry. Yep, and that reflects on one of your slides there. So we'll come back to that, and I'll take questions now. Councillor Cooper, please.
Thanks, Jenny. You did make a mention of Waitaku Ranges, but I suppose for me, we talk about financial implications, but are there any implications that you can see if we've got a stronger biodiversity, I guess, statement here that could affect track reopening in the ranges or anything in that? Because we've got a lot of contrary opinions, etc. at the moment, but could that be a national direction that might mean that would be changes to those? Or if you might not have talked to the ranges, but
I haven't talked specifically on that point, but I wouldn't have thought so, because my knowledge of that is being very much driven by biodiversity concerns, and so the MPS is just going to reinforce those concerns. And I think where it can be justified to open the track again, the MPS wouldn't preclude that happening, because we would only do it. We're confident we're not going to be, spreading kauri dieback. So I think overall not. It's just be another thing we'd have to take into account.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Hills, there's crossovers into your committee here. Would you like to second? Yeah, sure. Seconded by Councillor Hills. Jenny, these stretch provisions, voluntary rather than mandatory, in support of other councils, we don't often, maybe change our position necessarily to support other councils when we're quite firm in our own view, and that's well informed. So can you just take us through that, why we would maybe possibly change our position in support of other councils on that matter?
I'm talking here specifically about the requirement to develop a regional biodiversity strategy, including addressing restoration and enhancement of degraded SNAs, and the requirement to have management responses to highly mobile fauna. So those are three areas that essentially sit largely or partly outside of a plan provision. Some of it would be you'd be doing it not as part of your plan. I believe the other councils when they say that it's too much for them. It's too much for a council to have to both implement a whole response to Section 6C, identify SNAs, protect them, as well as doing all this other stuff. For us, we're in a position where we're already doing it. So the mandate that it would give us would be welcome, but it's not strictly necessary for us to do this stuff. And I think to put it as an absolute requirement on other councils, while it could in the long run be a good thing, I think at this time it's actually going to be counterproductive and might mean that councils just stall, really. They're going to sort of struggle to do anything. So having considered the realities of other councils around New Zealand, it does make sense from my point of view that those provisions no longer become mandatory. They're still there for us to use. We're still saying they should be in the MPS, including giving us a mandate to, for example, consider restoration options in our unitary plan if we want to. But that if expecting councils to do them all essentially at the same time, it all has to be done within 6 years. There's a lot of work for some of these very poorly resourced councils who've done essentially nothing to date. So that's the rationale there. So we're not asking them to be taken out, just asking it not to be compulsory at this time.
It's a reflection on the capacity and capability of some of the smaller councils around the country. But this would fall, primarily with regional councils in the first instance, would it not, which are larger?
Some of the provisions would. So the requirement for a regional biodiversity strategy is on the regional council. But some of those regional councils aren't terribly advanced in this space either. But some of the other stuff around restoration and enhancement and managing for highly mobile fauna could well fall down to district council level as well. So it isn't just at the regional council level. That's one of the things about this MPS. It's talking to both regional councils and territorial and district councils. In fact, it talks very poorly to unitary councils. Unitary authorities doesn't seem to acknowledge them at all. But
Okay, thank you. And just second question, final question, is on the medium and high. You're saying that they sort of lacks distinguishing attributes there, and our submission is talking about just going for one clear category that has to be met because of the risk of the medium category being used as an out. Did you explore whether there needed to be a greater definition on high and medium to ensure that the medium meant something quite different to high and that was inescapable before you landed with just a single category?
Yes, we did. We looked through that. So the MPS includes what they're called distinguishing attributes, so how you tell the difference between medium and high. And some of those are reasonably objective. So it talks about the presence of a nationally threatened species, for example, would trip it into high. But even those ones that are seemingly objective are actually, in that instance, for example, we don't have the information on necessarily nationally threatened species. We don't necessarily know where they are all the time. We didn't do that kind of survey when we did the SCA overlay because of the amount of work that would have taken. So we did look through those, but essentially it becomes very, ecology is already a relatively subjective science, if you like. There are, you need to bring your critical knowledge and experience to any situation to understand something. And so looking at those, it's very hard to see how you would make a distinction that was actually meaningful in all instances. And also, to be frank, the implications for the sites that are medium, even though the MPS is still quite staunch on those, over time we just think inevitably it will drive down the management of those areas when you're balancing up the other stuff we have to manage as a council, high growth area council. So we did think about it, but overall there was strong opposition to this, including because of past experiences with other councils that have done this in the past.
Councillor Walker, please.
Mine are comments more than questions. Some of them might verge into questions.
Can I, if it's a comment, so we'll go to comments now. Member Namani, would you like to lead? You're moving.
Kia ora, Jenny. Well, just kia ora koutou. We certainly advocated for the amendments up there, and I just wanted to provide a context. I think we're supportive of the resolutions as they stand. We think that the submission can be improved, particularly in two general areas. The first is kaitiakitanga is mentioned, is talked about, is referred to, but I think the relationship of Māori with Indigenous biodiversity hasn't been correctly captured yet within the body of the submission, and that just provides context to some of the other matters that will that are traversed in there. And I think, you know, just looking at that lens, yes, nationally, but also in an Auckland context. You know, I can use an example, the incorporation of Te Ao Māori worldview that comes with kaitiakitanga. The fact that kaitiakitanga, one of its key roles is to develop mātauranga. You know, mātauranga Māori comes from the kaitiakitanga, and where does all that happen? It usually happens where there is lots of Indigenous biodiversity, and that's not necessarily just on Māori land. That can be on council land, that can be on Crown land. And so I think, and also just assumptions around the ecologist paradigm. There's a whole Te Ao Māori worldview in that whole mix that I think we should just recognise in the body of the submission. We don't have any problems as it pertains to land that isn't Māori, apart from that kaitiaki comments. As it relates to Māori land, we all know from the vicissitudes of history that a higher proportion of Māori land is usually covered in Indigenous biodiversity by the mere virtue of the fact that there were intentional policies and programs put into place to prevent Māori from developing their land. So zoom up to 2020, it's inherently unfair to then put Māori land over the same cover, I guess, as the other, you know, the other rationale. So we can see in the proposed Impious that they've attempted to accommodate that. And I guess that might be where there's a bit of conversation around that nexus of hierarchies. I think they've attempted to accommodate that through the use of hierarchies, whereas this, you know, the submission potentially is saying something else. So we need to just kind of talk about that so that it at least acknowledges that. And I think ultimately the goal is not to limit any aspirations for land development on Māori land, but ensure that they're balanced against the need to maintain and protect flora and fauna. And I guess that's generally where we are coming from. And you know, we think, we don't necessarily think that the unitary plan to date has actually figured that out yet, figured that tension out. And I don't think it's unique to Auckland. It's a challenge going forward. So I just wanted to provide that context to those amendments and I guess our involvement on the delegated group that would end up approving the final submission. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Namani, and thanks to the Independent Māori Statutory Board contributions here. I know it's an important submission for yourselves. And for all of us, further debate on this. Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. It's not so much debate, just some comments. Certainly agree with the merging of medium and high value. That's great. I guess the comment I'd make around that, or the suggestion, we may have an area that's somewhat degraded, but because of community pest control, a whole range of things, it switches from a degraded area to conceivably something of very high value. And that is happening in many locations around New Zealand. So that's something that you could capture, I would suggest. And I guess what runs alongside that is you could have a degraded area, but it might be the only area that's representative of a particular ecotone or type or the like, in which case it's really important to apply some effort to it and retain it. So I toss that in. Just looking at 190, where you add, you know, light, noise, vibration and emissions around that, are we capturing sediment runoff and so on somewhere, and I'm assuming they're in there?
That is reasonably well captured already, but I think it's a good point. We could potentially raise it as a specific issue we think should be considered as an adverse effect, because it definitely does apply, especially to the freshwater ecosystems, obviously.
Sure. Well, I would say it's a significant adverse effect. If you look at the recent State of the Hauraki Gulf report, and I'd suggest you reference that, there are any number of instances where we've had catastrophic events caused by silt runoff, amongst other things. And I think if we can make a reference to that report, which is just out, that would be useful. I'll just toss that in. The other concern is around the monitoring, that's E1, and I think we need to give more emphasis to that, even if it means giving ourselves more of a hard time, because my experience is that the monitoring that has occurred in legacy councils and this council has not been great. For example, we have bush covenants that the Rodney District Council put in place, and there was a very poor monitoring regime around them. They may often carry over into SNAs. I really don't know what's happening there, Mr. Chair, because we haven't had any report much on monitoring for some time, but I venture to say if we asked ourselves what the state of our terrestrial environment is in detail, we'd get some nasty surprises. The other thing that's of concern, and I just go back to 190 where it mentions pets and livestock, and I know we mentioned our pest control plan and the like, but we've got the notion of not just pest plants, but plants that people might introduce that aren't part of the local ecosystem. That might be a kauri or a putakawa or whatever, and effectively you add to a degrading of the local ecosystem. Is that something that's relevant, that's covered off? Because it's not inherent in our pest plan, but it does go to the stability and the sustainability of SNAs and so on over time.
Actually, Councillor, that isn't a point that's well covered by the Impious, and we usually advocate for use of eco-source plants, etc., when you're doing any kind of restoration for those reasons that you've talked about, the potential for it to undermine the ecological diversity, the diversity of the area. So I think that could potentially be a point that could be raised. The restoration and enhancement provisions should be pushing towards use of appropriate native plants, that are native to the area.
Sure.
Potentially we could raise that as another point, yeah.
And the other issue that just goes to the medium and the high SNA areas, quite often you've got an area that's of higher category, and around it you've effectively got a buffer of medium, and then it degrades even further. And one of the things that we know is that for the integrity of an area, size is important. And there was a study in Rodney around that also helped to inform the size of the bush covenants and so on. So there's the notion of size as well, and that can vary according to what the feeding requirements are of a different species or like. Is that something that we should be covering?
That is quite well covered already by the MPS, in that it does have some recognition of larger areas having some, having a large area, a large extent, giving it some value. But I think we'd be cautious about that, because there are some ecosystems that you might only find in very small patches. So I think size is a relevant consideration when it comes to viability, but it may not be relevant when you're thinking about significance. So I think we would probably not want to push too hard on size as a standalone criterion, but it's definitely relevant for some situations.
Okay, and then the last thing I'll just cover off is on 105, which is around the lack of protection of urban trees. Are we going to provide any supporting information around that as to the catastrophic nature of what is occurring there, and increasingly the significance of it, because we're seeing obviously clearance on private land that's of a high order, and very mature pahutakawas, other forms of vegetation. Are we giving significant emphasis to that?
So the submission takes a stance. It uses basically we've got 3,600 hectares of urban SEAs, and we could not protect those using district plan rules. So, I mean, I think that's a pretty, personally, I feel that's quite a significant statistic, if you like. And I guess the truth is, when it comes to demonstrating impacts on urban trees, our data is a bit poor. We've got anecdotal data. We are looking at trying to improve that from a monitoring perspective, and we could potentially put some stuff in there about the loss that we do know we've had, but it's at this stage is not terribly convincing from a scientific point of view. But I can certainly look to see if there's some stats we could shove in there that would support the point.
So I'm talking about the loss of urban trees on private property.
Yes, well, so there is some stuff we could put in there definitely to show what's happened there, but I guess that might undermine our point slightly because we use regional rules to protect our SEAs, so we can already protect our urban SEAs from clearance using those rules. So we are talking essentially about biodiversity outside of SNAs, which is still important. But yes, I'm more than happy to put an extra if that's appropriate. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks for those contributions. We'll move on, and Jenny's nodded affirmatively that a lot of those proposals are consistent with policy directions we've already confirmed, so we can recognise that in the submission, and those minor changes that are reflected in the red and the C there, we'll keep an eye out for those changes coming through. Councillor Walker, the Chair, Deputy Chair and Independent Māori Statutory Board member. So thank you, Jenny, for guiding us through that important submission, important work by the government, and we will lodge that very shortly. It is moved, it is seconded, and I will put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, Jenny.